Our next question tonight is talking about gear that we have, or pieces of our equipment that we have built in the past. So if you've been in this long enough, well, if you're as long as I've been in this, much of the cool stuff that we have today didn't exist back then. And if you've heard Ben Stowe tell the story of back in the 90s when he started out, his very first lights were cream corn cans, and he built them by hand. He's not the only DJ who did that. I've got 3 different DJ friends in the upper Midwest here who still have coffee can lights or cream corn cans, in their shed that are, hey, this is my first ones, and I built them myself, and it was kind of the badge of honor back then. But did you guys? Is there any piece of gear that you guys have built that basically was not something that you purchased as a completed thing? You had to buy the parts and you built. And I know, Dan, obviously you've talked about one that you've done, but we can see if there's anything beyond that that you have built. So, Cubby, were you starting this one, or was Dan?
I can start it because this could be real short.
Okay,
no, I'm not at all. I am about as handy as a foot. So, but I do remember the days, Colorado Sight and Sound. Remember that guy? He'd come up with those boxes and he'd make these wooden boxes and put these big par cans in them, and he had all 4 of them at once. And then I never built them. I bought them, but I'm not very handy at all. So Mm-mm.
Dan, what things have you built over the years?
Mr. Handyman.
I'm going to be kind of like Cubby. I haven't done a lot. I've never really considered myself very handy, despite my last name. It's not something I'm an expertise in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, it took a little bit, but it's all right. But no, so the only extent I would probably say I started dabbling this a little bit ago when I wanted to have a DJ coffin for my controller, and there wasn't anything that gave me all the things that I wanted to be able to fit into one size. And when the style went to that coffin setup, like I was used to the 19-inch rack mounts, so that were like 8 spaces underneath, right? And when we went to the coffin, we didn't have that. So I modified I modified the one that I had to be able to give me an extra rack space. It allowed me to mount my half-wave antennas on top, and I had everything ready to go with that, thanks to that modification. That was the only other thing I've ever done other than my booth. And that was, and again, very similar idea was, at the time I really didn't know of people who you could buy them from, that were local enough that would have made it doable. And so I made the booth using some ideas that people had handed out. So those are about my extent of those 2 things.
So the first thing we built was a coffin. It was because 19-inch rack spaces were kind of becoming a thing, but all those home CD players and a turntable you could make. So we basically made a coffin that was, 4 feet wide. So you had basically a set of rack spaces here and a set of rack spaces there. And we had turntable, mixer, tape decks, and a couple of CD players in this thing. It weighed like 80 pounds, and people would say, "Oh, there's the dog coffin," as we would carry this thing in, because it had handles on the sides, and it would take 2 of us to carry this thing in. That was our first. And then we built a variation of that for the amp box, which had it was a wheeled thing that it was made out of 2x4s and had big handles on it, and it would handle. We had the crossover and the it was just 2 CS800s in that, which are the PV amplifiers that weighed 70 pounds or whatever they were. This is the old CS800s. And if they had the little module that you could plug into the back, and that's where the crossover was in there. So there was no crossover. It was just basically you drop the 2 cords, plug it in, and that was a beast. That was a beast also. Cubby, you mentioned the box lights. When the very first time we saw those down in Las Vegas, I oh my gosh, this is awesome, but I'm not paying that much for them. So
he was high.
Yeah. And so we came home and started to build boxes like this, and putting cans in them, and then dropping all the cords out of the back of it, and putting a dimmer pack on there, and then having it all synced up. So at one time, our light show had 2 boxes that sat up on the speakers, that we made those wooden boxes up on top of the speakers that had 4 floods in it. And then on top of the floods were a light show of J.C. Whitney 12-volt beacons. And those were all controlled by a homemade switch box that was powered. They're 12 volt fed into it, and then you had these little momentary switches that you could play like a piano. We built all that, and then down below us in the middle was a box that had 8 floodlights in there that were all kind of connected with that to the dimmer pack. So you had all the floods that could, there were 16 floods that were chasing, and then you had those other lights. But we built a lot of different boxes, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. Some people mentioned, of course, building actual pin spots and amps and different things. We tried building speakers. I knocked off the bag end subwoofer design. Basically, took and built the identical box to it, and it went so well we ended up building like a dozen of them, and we used 2. So I had all these cabinets that we built, and we're like, okay, so as soon as we get big and we need extra speakers, we're just going to go and use put the woofer in there, and we've gotten I think I ended up throwing them out and to the burn pile or something. I don't even remember what ended up.
Last year?
Yeah, it was actually last weekend. I was trying to before the snow. It's only been 25 years since we built those. And then I wanted to build this big club sub that was a dual sub. So I made this huge box and probably had what would have been in 2020 like $300 worth of plywood. Yeah, 2 sheets. But this huge thing. It was 8 feet. It was 8 feet long. It was 3 feet tall, and 3 feet deep. And I've tried putting subs in there at different, the cones at different, woofers at different, and I never could figure it out. And then somebody said, "Oh, there's sound waves, and there's ways of measuring, and there's all these." And it's like, I don't want to think that much. It went in the stack, and it found its way to the burn pile. I think it's last week also. And then
you talk about last week. I had the same problem where I'm going through my garage, got an old gear, going, "Gosh, should I keep that? Should I not keep that?" I mean, I've had that mixer for 20 years. It is a good mixer, So
yeah, exactly.
I had the same problem as you do, getting rid of stuff.
Well, I had when we were expanding and such. I ended up buying some of these Newmark mixers that had the little Chaos pad, and they were early versions that had XLR out. And it's like, this is a nice little mixer. And I ended up buying 3 of them at the time because we were going to be expanding, and we were using some PV. Mixers at the time, PV 9072s. And it's like, okay, we want to transition to that, 2 things that use XLR. So I bought these things, and they sat in there in the shelf, in the box, and I pulled them out and tested it. And it's like, okay, great. But then we went and bought Vestex instead, which were a better quality mixer. I ended up finding those things like 17 years later, whatever it was, still in the box, and I opened them up, and I think one of the 3 worked. The others were dead, and it was just years of being, in storage, and they weren't even stored on the climate-controlled side of the shed. It was in the cold side, we'll call it. So it's like, oh, well, I guess that answers the question. They're all going to the garbage. There's no, yeah, building of gear. That was something for a minute there, and the last thing I probably built for. That I actually use. It's probably been 15, 20 years since I think I've become cubby.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's nothing. So Dan, you're the most handy one now in the last number of years. I learned my lesson the hard way after having stacks of the crap, and it's like, why do I still have these knockoff SKB amp racks out here? Have I ever done anything? No. Burn them next week. We'll get them. All right, let's jump to our next question.